There is no written documentation of this, especially from Thomas Jefferson himself, but evidence shows that the Hemings, an enslaved family, may have been one of his favorites. I'm the NYC Traveler, and we're at Monticello in Virginia. Thomas Jefferson realized that he could try to build a stronger, self-sufficient, and profit-making plantation if families stayed together. Not only would they give birth to more labor, they would be happier together, working together, learning valuable skills that would help the operation. As Monticello changed from focusing on growing tobacco to wheat, less labor was required in the fields, meaning more workers could learn trades such as cookery, tinsmithing, stonemasonry, blacksmithing, and everything associated with construction. Thomas Jefferson married Martha Scales Skelton, a young widow who had lost her husband and later her child. She came to the marriage with land from her father and late husband and so many enslaved people that Jefferson was able to expand his estate, complete construction, and continually remodel the mansion. Along with Martha came the Hemings, probably today one of the most well-known enslaved families from history. This is rare because at many southern pre-Civil War plantations, records of enslaved people were usually restricted to first names, birth and death dates, and records of sales. Families were often split up, either intentionally to prevent lasting relationships or because the owners were in debt. Some owners tried to sell family members together, some did not. The Hemings family was different. Coming originally from Mrs. Jefferson's father, they were hers for life. They were trained with trade skills, given privileged positions, and none of them ever worked in the fields. Born circa 1735, Elizabeth Hemings, nicknamed Betty, was the daughter of an African woman possibly named Parthenia and a white sea captain named Hemings. According to a family legend, when Captain Hemings learned that Betty was born, he tried to find his daughter. By the time she was 10 or 11 years old, in 1746, she was the property of Francis Epps in Virginia. Francis had a daughter, Martha Epps. She married John Wales, Mrs. Martha Jefferson's father. Those were her parents. As a wedding gift, Betty was given to Martha Epps, and she went to John Wales's plantation. Daddy Francis stipulated that Betty and her heirs would always belong to Martha and her heirs. John Wales would be widowed and he would marry 3 times. Betty had 12 children. Numbers 5 through 10 were sired by John Wales, making those 6 kids the half-siblings of Mrs. Martha Jefferson. Martha married Thomas in 1772. Part of the dowry included property and enslaved persons. When her father died in 1773, she inherited more enslaved persons, including Betty and her 10 kids. After Betty came to Monticello, she eventually had 2 more children. There are records of all 12 children, first and last names, birth and death dates, and factual information about their lives. Trained as a domestic worker, Betty had her own cabin at Monticello. She raised chickens and crops and sold them to Thomas Jefferson. The information on the 12 children varies, from much about some to very little about others. Child 1, Mary Hemings, was a seamstress who had 6 children. Daniel was given to Jefferson's sister. Molly was given to his daughter Martha. Joseph Fawcett was freed in Jefferson's will and earned money to purchase his wife and most of his kids after they were sold when Jefferson died. Joseph, who had a different last name, was Betty's grandchild, helped to make a landau, a carriage for Jefferson when driving another type of carriage became too tedious for Jefferson. He lived with his wife Edith Hearn in one of the cook's rooms. It was a small room and they had 10 children, 8 of whom may have lived here also. They may have earned money as well and supplemented their own diet by fishing, gardening, hunting, and other ventures. Joseph was freed when Jefferson died, but not most of his family. They were sold. Throughout the years, he purchased all of his family back except one. That one was bought by a friend and given back to the family. Joseph's daughter, Anne, married Tucker Isaacs, and they had a daughter, Virginia. Virginia married James Monroe Trotter, who had a government position in Washington, D.C. James, in turn, had William Monroe Trotter, a prominent abolitionist who went to Harvard, worked with W.E.B. Du Bois, and met President Woodrow Wilson, among other achievements. Part of this family also was Betsy, who may have been fathered by Jefferson, was given as a wedding present to the younger Jefferson daughter Mary, aka Maria. When Maria died, Betsy may have been her husband's concubine and had children with him. She is buried in the family plot with the Epps family who owned her. This first daughter, Mary, was hired out to Thomas Bell, who purchased her and was her common-law husband. She had 2 younger children with him. She and the younger kids became free and inherited his estate in Charlottesville. During the Revolutionary War, Mary was taken prisoner and was recognized as a patriot of the Daughters of the American Revolution in 2007. Child 2 of Betty Hemings. Martin Hemings was a butler at Monticello. Child 3. Betty Brown was a domestic who worked at Monticello and in Richmond and in D.C. when Jefferson was in various political offices. Betty was also a prisoner of war in the American Revolution. She had 7 children. We're going to profile 2 of them. Wormsley Hughes, Betty Hemings's grandson, started out as a nail boy. He was ultimately what was called a hostler, or a stable hand or groom. He took care of the horses, a serious job since horses were transportation in those days. Wormsley cared for Jefferson's mount personally. He was also a gardener and sold his crop to the Jeffersons. Burwell Colbert, Betty Hemings's grandchild and Betty Brown's son, was trained as a painter and a glazier, someone who cuts and installs or removes glass. He was also the butler during President Jefferson's retirement. As butler, Burwell was trusted to have keys and worked very closely with Martha Jefferson Randolph, Jefferson's daughter, who served as mistress of the house. He was freed in Jefferson's will and actually purchased items from the estate once it was sold after Jefferson's death. One of his descendants, Brown Colbert, who started out as a nail boy, was involved in an issue with another worker who almost killed him when Brown hid one of his tools. As an adult, Brown immigrated to Liberia, but he died shortly thereafter. Later, a descendant of the Colbert family in America and one from Liberia met in 2016. Child 4, Nance, was given to Jefferson's sister. He repurchased her 10 years later, and she was a skilled weaver at Monticello. Child 5, Robert Hemings, bought his own freedom from Jefferson in 1794. Child 6, James Hemings, a famous Hemings. He came to Monticello at age 8. In 1784, he went with Jefferson to Paris when Jefferson was minister to France. Jefferson developed a fondness for French cooking, and James was trained as a chef. He was paid some wages and used some of his money to learn French. He also realized that while he was in France, he was technically free. Despite considering to remain in France, he did come back to America, first to New York with Thomas Jefferson while he was Secretary of State, and then later returning to Monticello, training the cooks there what he learned. He traveled with Jefferson extensively, sometimes trusted to go on ahead. Although the movie Jefferson in Paris shows James negotiating his freedom there, it was really in Philadelphia that they made the deal, that he could be free after he trained the chefs, including his brother Peter at Monticello, which he did. James could read and write. He traveled around, working in Baltimore and Philadelphia, and even back at Monticello briefly as a free man. James never married, nor are there any records of children. He was known to drink excessively, and sadly, he died as a result of suicide in Baltimore. James made a lasting contribution to American cuisine and comfort food. He took the basic French recipe of cheese and macaroni pie, added some Southern cuisine magic, and created the ancestor of American macaroni cheese, probably baked American macaroni and cheese. Child 7, Thenia or Thania Hemings, was sold to who would become President James Madison. Child 8, Critter Hemings. She married a free man of color, Zachary Bowles. When Jefferson died and daughter Martha sold the estate, Critter was purchased by Martha's nephew and lived in Charlottesville. She had at least one son, also called James, who ran away in 1801 when he was treated cruelly by an overseer. Child 9, Peter Hemings. He was a chef, having been trained by his brother James. Peter was also trained as a tailor, and Jefferson credited him with great intelligence and diligence in brewing beer for the estate. We're going to skip to child 11, John Hemings, who was by an Irish workman named Joseph Nielsen. For some reason, John chose to spell his last name with 2 M's. John played an important role in remodeling Monticello, working closely with the white laborer, James Dinsmore, in creating or supervising the beautiful woodwork at Monticello. He ran the joinery after Dinsmore left and created magnificent furniture. He also worked at one of the other family farms, Popular Forests. John could read and write and corresponded with Jefferson about the work going on. John married Priscilla. When Jefferson died, John was freed in his will, but he lived at Monticello for several years more. He probably stayed so that he could be with Priscilla, who was owned by Jefferson's daughter Martha and her husband. Priscilla was the nursemaid to the Jefferson grandchildren. She and John had no children together. And sadly, after Jefferson died, the joinery, where so many lovely pieces were created, fell into disrepair. Child number 12 was little Lucy Hemings. Records indicate that she probably died at age 9. Her father was possibly another enslaved man. What about child number 10, Sally? She'll have her own video. The legacy of Elizabeth Betty Hemings at Monticello runs deep. It's safe to say the history of the plantation would be very different without her and her 12 children and their descendants. I'm the NYC Traveler, and we've met the Hemings family of Monticello.